Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. It's time we discuss something easily misinterpreted, an idea that has run like an undercurrent beneath centuries of philosophical and political thought, but rarely surfaces in polite conversation anymore. That war, for all its horror, has been a profound source of cohesion, meaning, and vitality for civilization. This is not an endorsement of war, but it is an attempt to confront its deeper historical function, to ask, what happens to a society when the unifying ordeal of war largely disappears? What virtues erode when the blessings of peace become practically permanent? And is it possible to recover those virtues without the bloodshed? Before we get into it, thanks to everyone who supports the show. There are two main ways you can do that. First, leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This pretty significantly boosts the show's visibility and helps new listeners discover it. Second, you can become a supporter. You can join me at patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris or subscribe through Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Supporters get access to over a dozen bonus episodes, including the next one I'm planning to publish, which will be an exploration of the historical link between madness and greatness. Thanks again. Now let's get back to war. Following the news recently, reports of escalating conflict between Israel and Iran, American bunker busters striking multiple uranium enrichment sites, and speculation that China or Russia may yet be drawn into the fray, it might seem absurd to suggest that war is disappearing from modern life. And yet, for the vast majority of Western citizens, even this so-called 12-day war, as President Trump has tried to dub it, remains strangely abstract. At least outside of Israel and Iran, there is no draft. There is no civilian mobilization in response to these events whatsoever. No personal sacrifice beyond the price of oil or the direction of markets. Compared to the historical norm, today's conflicts, however serious in geopolitical terms, remain far more remote for the vast majority of us. And that remoteness is precisely the point. The modern West has not abolished war, but it has rendered it practically virtual. We live, most of us, in an unprecedented condition. Peace as the default. This is a blessing, to be sure. Yet there are nonetheless a set of consequences to be reckoned with. Much of today's commentary centers on the retreat of religion as the primary explanation for our mounting sense of alienation, our rising rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and purposelessness. And there is some truth in that diagnosis, but it's incomplete. Perhaps just as significant, but far less discussed, is the retreat of war, not only as a practical reality, but as a moral horizon, a framework for courage, duty, sacrifice, and honor. For centuries, war and religion were the twin forges through which societies hardened their highest values. As both recede, we're left with a vacuum of meaning that modern institutions seem ill-equipped to fill. This episode is about that vacuum. It's about the history of war not as policy, but as culture. And it's about what we lose, psychologically, socially, and spiritually, when warrior culture fades from view. To guide our exploration, we'll focus on one of the most elegant and provocative works ever written on this theme, The Warriors by J. Glenn Gray. First published in 1959, it is both a philosophical meditation and a psychological inquiry drawn from Gray's own experience as a World War II intelligence officer and his subsequent academic career. Gray writes not as a general nor as a pacifist, but as a witness. And what he saw in war was not only destruction, but the curious emergence of meaning. We'll also consider how Gray's work echoes and deepens earlier ideas, such as William James' essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, Nietzsche's critique of decadence, and Emil Durkheim's concern that modern societies, in the absence of shared struggle, fall into a state of disconnection and drift. These thinkers, in different ways, converge on the same anxiety that protracted peace, if not paired with purpose, can corrode a civilization from within. Let's begin with J. Glenn Gray's The Warriors. His book opens with a startling admission that most men who go to war do not do so out of hatred for the enemy or love of abstract ideals, but out of a deeper compulsion. The urge to action, he writes, has often been stronger than the motives of patriotism, hate, or idealism. What compels the warrior is not ideology, but the longing for intensity, for camaraderie, and for clarity in the face of chaos. Gray describes how war simplifies life. It strips away the ambiguity and inertia that plagues civilian routine and replaces it with stark necessity. Men who in peacetime drift through their days uncertain of their worth or direction, in war find themselves bound to others by urgent necessity. They experience, often for the first time, a sense of total involvement, of being needed, of mattering. That may be intense, but it's intensely satisfying. Contrast this with the characteristic drift of modern disillusionment. In the bureaucratic sterility of our peacetime societies, the virtues that once flourished under the pressure of war, such as toughness, discipline, and courage, have become suspect, even dangerous. Their expression is often pathologized as toxic masculinity. Yet, what today's critics of masculinity call toxic is, in many cases, the evolutionary momentum of instincts and impulses that long served a vital role in the cohesion of tribes and the very survival of societies. For much of history, men not only ensured their own and their loved ones' survival through physical aggression, but found purpose through ordeals that channeled aggression into meaning, whether in war or through more productive life or death pursuits like exploration. Today, those energies have fewer outlets. The innate drive many men have to seek struggle, risk, and a kind of glory has not disappeared. It has simply been denied. And in its denial, it festers. The result turns out to be not only peace, but also widespread anxiety and aimlessness. Gray understood this tension. He wrote of men returning from war to peacetime civilian life and finding it absurd, incoherent, or spiritually emaciated. Quote, "The qualities war demanded were no longer called for, and worse, they were no longer honored." End quote. The warrior, once revered, is recast in prolonged peacetime as a relic. But in losing the warrior ideal, society loses a timeless rite of passage. War demands not only savagery, but the virtues that most men cannot help but adore. When men are called to fight, war has a way of reawakening those virtues, no matter how dormant. And this changes men who see action on the battlefield, often permanently. Past societies knew that, and tried to leverage it productively. Now, Gray is careful not to romanticize war. It's awful and gross. He describes war as a crucible of the soul. It may burn away illusions, but that fire can also deform. Still, the central insight remains that war, for all its moral ambiguity, has functioned as a generator of profound meaning in human life. This was precisely William James' argument in 1910. In his famous essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, James observed that peace had become the mother of idleness. Without struggle, societies decayed into comfort and complacency. James did not praise war's destructiveness, but rather its power to discipline. He wrote, quote, "The martial virtues of war are what keep a society from rotting. Courage, endurance, loyalty, heroism, and the capacity for strenuous endeavor." End quote. His challenge was this: how can we preserve these virtues without killing each other? James called for a moral equivalent, a civic structure that would channel the best of martial energy into peaceful enterprise. He imagined a civilian conscription where every young person would serve the common good with the same rigor expected of a soldier. Over a century later, no such institution has materialized, at least not in America. Instead, what has proliferated is a simulacrum of militant engagement, activism without any significant risk, outrage without serious courage, identity without a true sense of duty. We've retained the tribal impulse, but stripped it of responsibilities. The result is a performative moralism, where the sense of righteousness floats free of real antagonists, real commitments, or real danger. Even where war does persist, usually in some distant time zone, this moral vacancy deepens too. As Gray himself anticipated, modern conflict increasingly dissolves the intimacy that once defined it. In his chapter, The Death of the Enemy, Gray described how the traditional encounter with the foe, face to face, man to man, has vanished. Bombs fall from the clouds. Missiles are fired from behind screens. Modern military action no longer centers around direct confrontation with an adversary, but around the target coordinates. In severing the human connection between combatants, we not only mechanize violence, we anesthetize the moral weight of it. What this means is that the more technologically advanced our wars become, the less they feel like war at all. We've become spectators to our own violence. And in the absence of tangible struggle, the virtues of war wither even further. Friedrich Nietzsche anticipated the liabilities of all this, decadence, as he called it. In the late 19th century, he worried that the West, in abandoning its heroic and tragic worldview, was sliding into a condition of spiritual exhaustion. In Twilight of the Idols, published in 1889, Nietzsche mocked the complacency of the so-called last man, that future being who seeks only comfort, avoids all hardship, and sneers at greatness. The last man, Nietzsche warned, would be proud of his mediocrity and hostile to any demand that might raise his soul above the trivial. War, Nietzsche believed, was one of the few forces that could shake the last man awake, not for the sake of mere bloodshed, but because war revealed a world in which the stakes were real, consequences concrete, and values lived rather than debated. His critique was not a call for conquest, but a call to rediscover existential risk as a condition for a meaningful life, as a way out of decadence. Of course, and it bears repeating, there are obvious dangers in this line of thinking. One could easily distort these ideas into a celebration of militarism, or worse, fascism. But the point is not that war is good. It's that peace, absent an alternative source of spiritual challenge, may not be good enough. Erik Durkheim, the French sociologist and father of modern sociology, offered a more clinical lens to view this problem. In his study of suicide, Durkheim introduced the concept of anomie, a state of normlessness where individuals feel disconnected from the collective and unmoored from any shared values. He documented that suicide rates rose in times of peace and prosperity, when social roles became more ambiguous. War, ironically, tended to decrease the suicide rate. And from Durkheim's work, it became evident yet again that war seemed to rebind individuals to a shared social cause. He argued that war gave individuals a firm sense of having a place within the collective that really mattered. So, what does all of this imply for Western civilization in the 21st century? What happens when war is no longer a universal experience, but the latent craving for a warlike experience remains? Manifestations abound. We see it emerge in extreme sports, in the fetishization of apocalypse, in the political rage that imagines every opponent as an existential threat. We simulate war in video games, in film, in rhetoric. What we seem to be left with is a civilization that has preserved the language of virtue without its historical context. What Gray's book, The Warriors, forces us to confront is that war, for all its barbarism, has historically served as a uniquely effective way to forge adults out of children, communities out of individuals, and civilizations out of tribes. If we reject war, and we should, we must also take seriously the challenge of replacing its cultural and psychological functions. Of course, war hasn't vanished entirely. The United States still fields a powerful professional military. Special operations forces like the Navy SEALs and Green Berets undergo training that clearly cultivates the martial virtues we've been discussing. Beyond the US, Israel's IDF serves as another notable example where mandatory military service preserves a kind of national cohesion that most other Western societies have left behind. But these examples involve an increasingly narrow slice of Western society, and for good reason. Few would want to return to an era of universal military obligation. So this only sharpens the point. If war ultimately vanishes as the great common ordeal, what do we have in its place? What can give modern people, and especially modern men, the same sense of belonging, purpose, and transcendence through struggle without the corpses? Again, it's tempting to say we've already found those alternative outlets, that competitive sports, entrepreneurial hustle, or even extreme adventure can simulate some important aspects of war. To a point, they do, as the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga explored in his book Homo Ludens, published in 1938 on the eve of World War II. The play element in culture often does serve as a stand-in for older rites of conflict. But critics, from J. Glenn Gray and William James to Sebastian Junger, have objected that these peacetime simulations, while exhilarating, lack something elemental: the moral weight and absolute stakes of life and death. In war, outcomes matter because they carry irreversible consequences. In games, the scoreboard simply resets for another round. In business, the failure of one startup gives rise to the next. What's missing is not challenge, but gravitas. It's that gravitas, the necessity to endure for the sake of survival, for oneself and for one's people, that forges identity at a level no simulation can match. Without that, even our most intense peacetime pursuits risk becoming just another form of entertainment. Ultimately, confronting this challenge requires a new kind of honesty. The honesty to admit that the masculine impulses we've grown used to calling toxic may in fact be sacred. That aggression, competitiveness, stoicism, even hunger for danger, traits we so cavalierly pathologize in peacetime, are not moral defects, but moral raw materials to endure the hardest challenges humanity has faced. In times of crisis, it is those moral materials that have so often held the line against annihilation. The question in our protracted peacetime is not how to extinguish them, but how to channel them. One of the most promising substitutes for war's unifying power may not be found in simulated struggle at all, but in a new generation of real, heroic endeavor en masse. The prospect of space exploration fits that bill. Colonizing Mars would offer precisely the kind of existential challenge that once defined military campaigns: immense difficulty, immense risk, and immense meaning. And unlike traditional warfare, colonizing other planets would not be a zero sum contest of destruction, but a generative struggle, one that calls forth the best of us. This is no longer science fiction. NASA's Artemis program aims to establish a sustained lunar presence by the end of this decade, with Mars targeted soon after. SpaceX, already testing the fully reusable Starship launch system, envisions manned Mars missions within 10 to 15 years. The technical foundations are real and accelerating. But the moral foundation is even more important, a new frontier that demands not domination, but endurance, not conquest, but coordination. And crucially, this isn't a frontier reserved for men. If war historically channeled masculine energies through physical struggle and hierarchy, space exploration offers a broader, more integrative crucible, one as intellectual as it is physical, more a test of patience, collaboration, and resilience than of force. In the context of interplanetary colonization, the complementary strengths of men and women become not only relevant, but essential. Success will depend on intelligence, adaptability, long term thinking, physical and emotional stamina, and cooperative leadership. In this light, space is not just the final frontier, it may be the most unifying and elevating frontier we've ever embraced. The philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." That has always been true. But perhaps we are finally approaching the moment in our history when the living can imagine the end of war too, if only we are willing to recover its deeper lessons and reimagine them for a civilization determined not only to survive, but to thrive. I'm Brad Harris. So long.